The key isn't to avoid the hard days. The key is to recognize that they're part of what shapes you, because every time you face discomfort instead of drinking through it, every time you walk through a trigger without giving in, every time you show up even when you don't feel motivated, you're building emotional muscle. You're becoming someone with depth, with resilience, with real inner stability. And that's the stuff that lasts longer than motivation, longer than milestones, longer than any pink cloud high, because recovery isn't linear, but it's forward.
You've tried to quit before. Maybe it worked for a while. Maybe it didn't. But deep down, you know sobriety isn't just about not drinking. It's about finding peace, purpose, and finding yourself again. Welcome to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Each week, Tim shares hard-earned lessons from his own decade of recovery, real talk, real methods, and the mindset that helped him turn the fight of sobriety into a life he actually loves. This is the Sober and Happy Podcast. Now, here's your host, Tim Phillips.
Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Sober and Happy Podcast. You know, when we finally quit drinking, most of us expect life to get easier. We imagine this clean, peaceful version of our lives. Calm mornings, better relationships, less drama. And sure, some of that happens. But the truth is, life still gets messy. Bills still pile up. People still disappoint you. Bad days still hit out of nowhere. And sometimes you look around and think, wait, wasn't this supposed to feel better by now? It's one of the biggest surprises in recovery. Realizing that sobriety doesn't erase all the chaos. It just strips away the buffer that used to numb it. You start to feel everything again. Frustration, sadness, boredom, fear, all the things you used to drown out. And in those moments, it's easy to start wondering if you're doing something wrong. But you're not. You're just finally awake to live your life again. And that's not a sign that you're failing. That's proof that you're growing. Because here's the truth. Recovery doesn't make all parts of our lives easier. It makes you stronger. And that's what I want to talk about today. How to find peace, purpose, and power, even when life still feels messy after getting sober. There's this saying I love. If you find yourself in a hole, quit digging. Stopping drinking is the quit digging part. It's the first essential step. But here's the part most people don't talk about enough. When you finally stop digging, you're still in a hole. And one of the things sobriety does is finally give you a clear, unfiltered look at the hole that we put ourselves in. And for a lot of us, that moment is sobering in a whole different way. When I first got sober, my hole was deep. I hadn't held a job in years. I hadn't filed taxes in almost a decade. My license was suspended in 2 states. I was living on my mom's couch out of rehab. Everything I owned fit in the back of my truck that had 2-year-old tags and no insurance. I owed money to more people and places than I could remember. My credit was trashed, and every meaningful relationship in my life needed serious repair. And that's the honest truth about recovery. Early sobriety itself is messy, even after you put the shovel down. And we haven't even talked about all the firsts waiting for you. Your first loss sober, your first heartbreak sober, your first major stressful event without your old escape route, the first time you do something hurtful to someone else and you can't blame alcohol for it. Those moments could feel brutal because you're suddenly feeling everything more deeply. The guilt, the anger, the fear, the loneliness. But here's another part that doesn't get talked about enough. You also start to feel the good things more deeply. The first time you hit a sobriety milestone. The first moment you catch yourself handling something better than you would have 6 months ago. The first time feeling trusted. The first morning when you wake up and realize you don't have to clean up the mess you made yesterday. All of those moments have so much more meaning now because we could actually feel them. Alcohol didn't just numb the painful things, it flattened everything. Sobriety switches your feelings back on, and yeah, that can be overwhelming. But it also makes joy feel real again. It makes connection hit harder. It makes small victories feel meaningful because you earn them. That's the emotional truth of sobriety. You feel more, all of it. Not because you're broken, but because you're waking up. And even though it's messy and uncomfortable and raw, it's also the beginning of seeing who you actually are underneath all those years of running. And once that happens, something else becomes clear. Sobriety doesn't magically give you a new life. It gives you a clearer look at the one you already have. And that clarity can be both a blessing and a gut punch. Because once the fog lifts, you start noticing things you used to drink away. Stress, conflict, loneliness, disappointment, insecurity. But you also start noticing your strength, your courage, and your capacity to handle things you never gave yourself credit for. That emotional wake-up call is a part no one really prepares you for. You go from living numb to living awake, and it's a lot at first, but it's also the beginning of real growth. Because here's a surprising thing. Your growth almost always shows up in your actions long before you feel it in your emotions. You don't wake up one day magically feeling wise or calm or healed. You act that way first, and your feelings catch up later. You respond with patience before you actually feel patient. You choose honesty before you fully trust yourself. You stay present in hard moments long before it feels comfortable. You show up for people before you truly believe you're dependable. And that's why early sobriety could feel so confusing. You're doing the right things, but you don't feel like they count because internally you still feel scared or overwhelmed or fragile or unworthy. But those actions do count. In fact, they matter more than you realize. Every time you handle something even slightly better than you would have 6 months ago, you're building the emotional muscles that will eventually change how you feel. Every time you stay instead of run. Every time you breathe instead of explode. Every time you tell the truth instead of spinning a story. Every time you reach out instead of isolating. You're reinforcing the identity you're growing into, not the one you're trying to leave behind. You might not always feel an instant sense of pride in those moments, but they're laying the groundwork for future pride. You may not feel strong yet, but those moments are strengthening you. You may not feel healed, but those actions are healing you. And this is the part most people miss. You don't grow because life gets easier. You grow because you learn how to meet life differently. Messy moments aren't proof you're failing. They're proof that you're rebuilding. And when you start to see that, even just a little, recovery stops feeling like punishment and it starts feeling like you're finding yourself again. One of the most surprising parts of sobriety is that as you start feeling the hard stuff more intensely, you also start feeling the good stuff more intensely too. It doesn't always show up right away, but when it does, it hits in a way drinking never could. Because when alcohol is in your life, it doesn't just numb the pain, it numbs everything. Joy, connection, excitement, hope. Everything just blends together into this flat, numb feeling. But when you're sober, even small wins land differently. The first time you get through a stressful day without falling apart, that means something. The first time someone tells you, I'm proud of you. The first time you laugh, like really laugh. The first time you heal a relationship that you thought you lost forever. Those moments hit deeper because you're actually present for them. They're not being filtered through a substance. They're yours. Real, raw, unfiltered. And that's another reason why growth is so hard to see when you're in the middle of it. You're so focused on holding yourself together that you don't always notice the sparks of good showing up along the way. But they do show up. Sometimes it's subtle, like catching yourself thinking, I handled that better than I normally would have. Sometimes it's big, like realizing you finally feel connected to people again, not because you're performing or pretending, but because you're showing up as the real you. And all of that is part of climbing out of the hole. Sobriety doesn't just make hard feelings harder. It makes good feelings richer, fuller, and more meaningful. When you're no longer running from your emotions, you finally get to experience them, all of them, as they are. And that's not something to fear, that's something to look forward to. Because even though the tough feelings come back stronger at first, so does joy, so does pride, so does connection, so does the feeling of actually liking the person you're becoming. And that's important to remember because the next part of recovery could catch you off guard. The emotional swings don't settle into a nice pattern. They ebb, they flow, and sometimes they overlap in ways that don't make sense in the moment. One of the hardest truths about recovery, and one of the most freeing, is realizing that it's not a straight line. You don't wake up each day feeling a little better than yesterday. Some days you feel strong. Some days you feel fragile. Some days you handle everything like a pro. And other days you wonder if you've learned anything at all. And that doesn't mean you're failing. That means you're healing, because growth has never been linear. It's more like climbing out of that hole you've been standing in. You take a few steps up, you slip a little, you climb again, you rest, you start over. But each time you learn how to move differently. What matters isn't how perfectly you climb, it's that you keep climbing. And that's where a lot of people get discouraged. They think, if I was really recovering, I wouldn't still feel this way. Or if I'm having a hard day, maybe I'm not cut out for this. But feeling things, even inconvenient things, is part of the process. When you were drinking, you didn't feel these things. Not fully. Alcohol flattened everything. It stole the highs and the lows. It kept life small enough that you didn't have to experience the world honestly. Sobriety hands all that back to you, the full emotional spectrum. And relearning how to live with it takes time. So if some days feel messy or heavy or confusing, it's okay. You're not broken. You're not losing ground. You're just adjusting. And adjustment always comes with friction. The key isn't to avoid the hard days. The key is to recognize that they're part of what shapes you. Because every time you face discomfort instead of drinking through it, every time you walk through a trigger without giving in, every time you show up even when you don't feel motivated, you're building emotional muscle. You're becoming someone with depth, with resilience, with real inner stability. And that's the stuff that lasts longer than motivation, longer than milestones, longer than any pink cloud high. Because recovery isn't linear, but it's forward, even on the days it doesn't feel like it. In early sobriety, every little win really does feel huge. Those moments matter, and they feel big because they are big. But as you keep going, something shifts. The big wins start turning into quiet ones. You pause before reacting, and it doesn't feel like some heroic moment. You tell the truth, and it feels natural instead of scary. You walk away from something unhealthy, and you don't even realize that you did it until later. You feel something uncomfortable, and instead of scrambling for an escape, you just stay with it. And those things will feel less dramatic or even special the longer we stay sober. And even though that might sound a little disheartening at first, that's actually the best part. When something that used to take everything in you now feels ordinary, that's growth settling in. That's strength becoming your new baseline. That's you building a life that doesn't fall apart every time a feeling hits. Those quiet shifts, the ones you barely notice, that's where the real change happens. So as we wrap this up, I want you to remember one thing. You're doing better than you think you are. Not because everything feels easy, not because you figured everything out, but because you keep showing up, even on the days when it feels like you're not making any progress at all. Growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as a calmer reaction. Sometimes it shows up as a little more patience. Sometimes it's a simple fact that you stayed present instead of running from yourself. Those moments might not feel big all the time, but they're evidence that something inside you is shifting, even if you don't feel it yet. So here's the week's challenge. Take a moment to look back, not to judge yourself, but to see the places where you've already changed. Think about something that used to completely throw you out of whack, and then ask yourself, how would I handle that today? Even if the difference is small, it's important to recognize it, because those small shifts are the ones that rebuild your life. And little by little, they add up to something real, something steady, something you might not yet fully see, but you're already becoming. Until next time, my friends, thank you so much for listening, and keep living sober and happy.
Thanks for listening to the Sober and Happy podcast with Tim Phillips. If today's episode connected with you, share it with someone who needs it. You can follow Tim on social at I Am Sober and Happy and visit soberandhappy.com for tools, motivation, and more episodes. Remember, quitting drinking is just the beginning. The real goal is learning to love yourself and love your life. This has been the Sober and Happy podcast. See you next time.